Hi, I'm Paul Arrington, and I'm one of the consultants with the Florida SBDC network. And what I want to talk about is how to know how much startup capital is going to be required to start your business. And this is a very important issue because of the various reasons why some startup businesses fail. Probably the major one is that they didn't go into starting up their enterprise with a sufficient amount of capital in order to make sure that the business is going to be able to start up and then continue towards success. So let's look at some of the various the needs of capital in a business. So you could basically break it down into three different categories. One is startup capital requirements. The other one is working capital requirements, and then the third being cash flow projections. So think about it in this way. When you talk about startup capital requirements, well then that is the capital that's going to be needed from the moment that you're thinking about starting the business all the way up until when the business actually opens its doors or starts up. So what are all those various capital things that you need to think about acquiring during that time? Then, for the purposes of our discussion right now, when we think about working capital requirements, well then those are the requirements that once the business has started, well then how much capital is going to be needed, at least during that initial period of time, so that until the business really gets on its feet and is able to then take off on its own. And then cash flow projections becomes very important also, because then you want to look, we want to look at how much is going to be needed on an ongoing basis, month after month after month, to make sure that there is enough money in the business. So, starting first with those startup capital requirements, again, the issue is how much, as far as assets, you have to think about are going to be necessary for the business. And when I talk about assets, what I'm looking at primarily are, does your business require inventory? If it does, well then how much inventory? How much is it going to cost? Going out and actually getting actual estimates regarding that. How much equipment are you going to be needing in the business in order for the business to operate? How much furniture is going to be needed in the business in order for it to function? How many fixtures are going to be needed in the business? And when I say fixtures, I'm talking about the types of things, when you walk into a business, are affixed to the property. So the lighting, for instance, the signage outside, all those things are very important to really look at how much they're going to cost, and then preparing for making sure that you have enough money in order to cover those things. And of course, one of the major assets in a business is also any type of, if you're going to be buying real estate, well then what's going to be the cost involved in that? Having enough cash in the business obviously is an asset that's going to be important in the business as well. And that cash is going to be important because you also have then some expenses that have to be covered. Any type of marketing that you're going to be doing before you start the business up, any type of salaries that you're going to have to pay before the business starts up, any of those types of things, well then you want to make sure that you have enough cash in place. Rent that's probably going to be payable before you open the business, any type of deposits that have to be paid, utilities, all those types of things, you want to make sure that you have enough cash to start the business and bring it to the point where the business is going to be opening its doors or starting. So there are a number of checklists that may be available that you might want to look at in order to help you in that. I would suggest that, and one tool that I find to be very good in that is what's called the Wall Street Startup Calculator. If you Google Wall Street Journal Startup Calculator, well then you'll be able to find that. And the good thing about that particular tool is that it really prompts you through thinking about all the various startup expenses that you might otherwise not have thought about. And then at the end of that, of going through that calculator, well then you can actually export that into an Excel file and then download it, and that can become a part of your business plan. So that's one useful tool. There are other tools out there, but I would suggest that you might want to consider that. Working capital requirements. Okay, so now that you've thought about how much capital is going to be needed up until the point that the business opens its doors or is launched, well then how much is also going to be needed then in order to cover certain expenses during the first few months of business operations until the business really gets on the ground and is bringing in enough capital in order for it to operate on its own. So again, how many months do you want to have cash up front in order to cover what rent is going to be due, salary, those types of things. You want to make sure that there is enough working capital for the business to continue to operate in its early startup phase. And then last but not least, then you want to look at month after month after month for at least the first year how the business cash flows. As the saying says, cash is king, and that's very true. If you run out of cash at any given point in time or any given month, well then the business is not going to be in a very good position. So what I suggest with regards to doing cash flow projections is to develop an Excel spreadsheet, look at month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, and so forth, and then look at what, having that spreadsheet, how much is going to be coming in with regards to sales, how much you're going to have to spend for the expenses, and then is there going to be any cash at the end of the month. If you ever see at the end of any given month that there's not enough cash that's left over, well then you'll want to think in advance, this is how much an additional cash I'm going to have to bring into the business up front in order to cover those lean periods. Think about that in terms of really in long term whether the business is going to be viable. Also, when you do your cash flow projections, think in terms of seasonality. Most businesses have certain periods of time during the year in which sales are higher than during other times. I'm going to use an example. For instance, the jewelry business. You could imagine that during certain times of the year, the jewelry sales are much higher, usually around certain holidays. But that business is going to need enough cash in place in order to cover all of its expenses, its ongoing expenses, even during those lean months when sales are somewhat lower. So you want to make sure that you project and have enough cash in place in order to cover in order to cover even those leaner times. It also is good as far as doing cash flow projections in really determining what your cash flow break-even points are. So in any of those given months where you see that you're not bringing in enough money, well then, as I said earlier, you want to make sure that there's enough cash in the business ahead of time in order to cover those things. And it also is important and helpful in evaluating any changes or really developing what your assumptions are. So when you start up your business, just about everything in terms of sales projections is going to be assumptions because you haven't been there before, you don't know exactly how much you're going to be selling at any given point in time, but doing a cash flow projection allows you to really test those assumptions. And think about it. If you're saying, say, in month 1 that you're going to have sales of $2,000 and each item or unit that you're selling you're selling at $100, well then what you're really saying is that you're going to successfully sell 20 units. So then what does that mean in terms of what type of marketing you're going to be doing? What type of marketing strategy you're going to be pursuing in order to make sure that you really reach that goal for that month? So in summary, when you think about and prepare for how much capital is needed in a business, you want to think in terms of how much you need to bring in order to get the business launched up to the point of actually starting the business and opening the doors. How much is going to be needed within the first couple of months as additional working capital in order to make sure that you've taken care of all the expenses that the business is going to incur before the business is able to get on its feet and really operate on its own. And then also testing the viability of that business concept by doing the cash flow projections month after month after month for at least the first year to ensure that there's enough cash in the business in order for it to operate.
So, now that you have a good idea, a sound business model for what you're doing, you have a good idea of what your abilities are and capabilities, you know what you're not good at and you're solving that problem, and you've put together a good business plan, it's time to go out and get capital. You need the right amount of capital to run your business, as we talked about before. There are really only 2 sources of capital. There are 3 that are mentioned in the world, but only 2 really work, especially for a new business. The first is debt, and debt is frankly borrowing money. That could be a conventional loan, it could be people loaning you money on the side, but whatever it is, you're going to have to pay it back. Equity is a situation where you invest in your own business and you hope to get your money out of the business someday. And then, of course, some people may want equity if they're going to help you out with the business as well. This is very common with angel investors, for example, or anybody else that wants a piece of the business, as they say. So you're probably saying to yourself right now, well, that's great, but I intend to get a grant. Well, grants are difficult, if not impossible to get, especially for a new entity. Grants are, I don't know, probably one of the great myths in our capitalistic society. Please do not waste a lot of time trying to get a grant because they're simply not out there. And there's not enough money in the world for all the people that would want grants for their new business. There's a whole lot of people out there that would love to help you get a grant for a fee. Please avoid these people because they're really not going to help you get a grant. And you're going to have wasted all that time. There's simply no replacement for a good, solid business plan and conventional borrowing or some other source. That's going to be a lot easier for you. So please avoid grants.